Okay, this is coaching workshop number 1, Foundations of eSchool and Block Schedule. We'll be doing a screencast version of the original presentation, so this will be a quicker version that just focuses in on the content of the presentation. We started the presentation by having folks go to menti.com, which is a website called Mentimeter, where students can enter polls, question and answers. In this case, we used it for a word cloud. So attendees entered their responses to a question. Type in one word that captures your feeling about remote teaching from last spring, and this is the word cloud that was created live during the presentation. We acknowledge that a lot of the feelings were stressful, frustrating, exhausting, and challenging, and we just kind of paused to acknowledge that that was completely understandable, that the task and challenge of e-learning in the spring was one that was quite difficult and taxing, but that we have a lot of resources working in our favor this time. Time, support, and wisdom and guidance that we've learned from having tried this in the spring. So we began the presentation with some renewed energy to make this really successful. Okay, so after we looked at the word cloud on mentimeter.com, we launched into our presentation, which is loading, and we talked about how the focus of today's session was going to be on adjusting our curriculum to remote teaching. So let's take a look at what that's going to look like. There's two considerations that we're going to be looking at. Consideration number 1, what components of my lesson will be synchronous and what will be asynchronous? And component number 2, how do I adjust my teaching to accommodate a block schedule? So we first began by defining the terms synchronous, semi-synchronous, and asynchronous. Synchronous learning being teacher and students are actively learning at the same time. Semi-synchronous being teachers and students are logged into a shared platform but are not actively learning, such as students may be performing independent tasks while the teacher is available, offering support to some or performing some other tasks. And asynchronous learning where students are learning in a separate space and or at a separate time. So these are terms that we are going to be using in today's workshop, and also terms that you may want to familiarize your students with so that you can be using them to navigate through different parts of your lesson. So here we stopped and folks talked about their experience last spring and what modes of learning they were using, but we'll keep moving here. We wanted to acknowledge why it is that we're having this conversation. The extended eSchool schedule does have primarily synchronous learning time scheduled. However, the D128 remote learning plan says that meetings should begin at the start time of each scheduled period and that student attendance is required at all meetings, but it also acknowledges that teachers have flexibility in determining the length and structure of synchronous meetings during scheduled class times. Because of this, teachers are going to want to make some decisions about what kind of learning is happening synchronously and what kind of learning is happening asynchronously during their any given lesson. So in other words, the entire lesson does not have to be synchronous. So let's talk about when you would choose to do various parts of synchronous and asynchronous learning. There are 3 major considerations any teacher needs to make when they're scheduling a lesson. How will my students interact with the course content? How will my students interact with other students? And how will my students interact with me, their instructor? And the point of this slide here is just to make the case that you can accomplish any of those 3 things both synchronously and asynchronously. So for example, how will my students interact with the course? Synchronously or semi-synchronously, you can have direct whole class or small group instruction via Zoom or Google Meet. You can have students write about, talk about, or in some way work with the course content on their own or in small groups during class, but you could also accomplish that asynchronously, as you see over here. You could read, watch, listen to, or have students videotape the pre-recorded content on their own, so they're watching pre-created content, and the students can write about, talk about, or in some way work with the course content on their own outside of class. So you can have them interact with your course content live during class or asynchronously on their own. Question number 2, how will my students interact with other students? During class, synchronously or semi-synchronously, you can have turn-in talks, breakout groups during class, you can have collaborative slides, you can have jigsawing, so all of that can be happening during class together, or you can have students collaborating asynchronously over here. They could be collaborating on a Google Docs on their own time, they could have student-led Google Meets and Zooms outside of your class time, or they could have group work that they're simply coordinating on their own. So again, they can collaborate with each other during class or outside of class or during asynchronous learning during your scheduled class time. Number 3, how will my students interact with me, their instructor? You can have whole class instruction, individual or small breakout groups during class, live feedback in docs or with shared screen during class, or at games and competitions that can be happening during class. So there can be live interaction during semi-synchronous or synchronous learning, But you could also be interacting with your students asynchronously, such as small group or individual conferences during office hours, or written, audio recorded, or video recorded feedback that can be happening at another time. So again, the point here is to say that you can accomplish all that you need to as a teacher, both synchronously and asynchronously, so you do have some decisions that you need to make. So let's think about when you're going to determine synchronous versus asynchronous learning. So times that you might want to prioritize synchronous or semi-synchronous learning is when you are introducing something new, students will need more support or feedback, the learning topics are sensitive or difficult, the live discussion is important to the content, students struggle with engagement, work completion is problematic, working with populations who have higher learning needs might require more synchronous learning, or you're trying to differentiate, so some students might work with you synchronously while others can work independently. So these are some considerations that you might want to make when prioritizing your synchronous or semi-synchronous learning. However, you might be able to use asynchronous learning to accomplish some of your learning tasks as well. So for example, if there are students who are comfortable with a topic or activity, that might be an okay time to send them into asynchronous learning. Perhaps peer collaboration without a teacher intervention is possible. Students demonstrate ability to work independently. Content is relatively straightforward and can be read, watched, or listened to independently. Or you assign a learning tool that allows for supported independent work, such as Newsela, MathXL, or Edpuzzle. So there are appropriate times for students to be working asynchronously as well. Here we paused the presentation and attendees had a chance to reflect on their own curriculum, thinking about when they would prioritize synchronous learning and when they might be using asynchronous learning. But if you'd like to pause and do so now, feel free. Okay. At this time, we went into Google Classroom and participants interacted through Google questioning to pose and respond questions about synchronous and asynchronous learning. A transcript of those Google questions are still available in Google Classroom, so feel free to take a look at what your colleagues have posted and you can reply to somebody if you'd like. The second consideration is how do I adjust my teaching to accommodate a block schedule? So in addition to considering when will my teaching be synchronous and asynchronous, I also have to adjust to a new format of teaching. So here are some considerations for planning a block lesson. You want to think of your lesson in terms of 15-minute chunks, give or take. Vary the type of activities from direct instruction to discussion to individual work time to small group work time, etc. Vary the platform of learning, so maybe between Google Zoom or Google Meets, video content, web reading, etc. So kind of moving around different platforms of learning. Considering incorporating individual work and practice into the block schedule as opposed to homework. So during that hour and 15-minute of learning time, you might want to try to have your individual practice or homework time take place during that stretch. That will be important for students not to be given hours of extended screen time in the evening to continue working on their computers, but it will also be a great opportunity for you to give live feedback while students are working and cut down the need for communication outside of class, which we know happened a lot last spring and was kind of overwhelming for teachers and students. So if you can, if it works for your course, you might want to consider prioritizing student work time or homework time during the block schedule so that you can be available to answer questions. And lastly, you want to incorporate brain and movement breaks. Remember that students are going to be sitting at their screens, as you will be, for hours on end during e-learning. So it's really important that we incorporate brain and movement breaks into our lessons. Let's talk a little bit about a sample block lesson schedule. This is available in the Google Classroom resource that was sent out, but this is a link that has various block schedule sequences that you can use while you're planning your block lessons. At the top is a definition of synchronous, semi-synchronous, and asynchronous again, just for your reference. And then there's a table of contents here where it's bookmarked to various lesson plans. So you can see here, if you click on any of these lesson plans, it'll take you to, for example, here it'll take us to bookmark number 1, which is sequence number 1, synchronous and semi-synchronous heavy. So as you can see here, this is a sample lesson plan template that walks you through a block schedule plan that is heavy on the synchronous and semi-synchronous time. If you scroll down throughout the document, you'll notice that there's various other sequences that you can look at. So feel free to pause, hop into this document through the Google Classroom resource, or email me if you need access to it. But it just kind of gives you different sequences and allows you to see what different modes of learning can be as you schedule your lesson. There's also space at the bottom for you to practice planning one such activity. So that's what we spent some time doing during the live presentation. Okay, so you have this resource that takes you through these different sequences. As you can see, there's different ways to structure a block schedule. So that's a resource for you to use. We ended the session with folks sharing out some of their lesson plans. So some of the participants were given the opportunity to share their screen, and they walked us through various sample lessons. So that's what we ended the session with there. We also kind of noted that we used some various remote teaching moves. So for example, we used Mentimeter for a word cloud hook. We use small group breakouts to reflect and process. We use Google Question to share ideas, questions, and to respond. We use semi-synchronous work time with assignments sent out in Google Classroom. We use virtual elbow buddy breakouts to share our thinking. We used a Google form to gauge individual work and whether a participant was willing to share. And then we used participant share screen for students to share work with the class. So we just ended by pointing out some of the e-learning moves that we made here in case teachers wanted to replicate those during their teaching. I wanted to emphasize that both Vernon Hills and Libertyville is available to help, so you can complete requests for support with remote teaching, block scheduling, social emotional learning, or any other kind of support that you might need. But just a reminder that your instructional coaches are available to help. So hopefully you found this quick overview of our session helpful, but if not, please reach out to me, Ellen Macias, email there at the bottom, for further support and creating a block schedule and determining synchronous versus asynchronous learning. Thank you.